First story, Whispers Under Holloway. I was supposed to be sweeping. That was my job, night janitor at Holloway High, a sleepy town on the wrong side of the interstate. But that night became something else. I had spent the day talking with Principal Carter about the missing kids. Marcus, an art kid everyone liked, and Evelyn, who vanished the same week Marcus stopped coming to class. The police had shrugged, parents prayed, and the rumor mill spun like a broken fan. People said runaways, people said accidents. I said nothing. I had seen things no one would believe. The basement door smelled like wet chalk and old engine oil. The light flickered when I pushed it open, and the thermostat on the wall read a temperature that made my breath fog. On the concrete near the boiler, someone had drawn crosses, small, crude, overlapping, like a child tracing cracks in the sidewalk. They were drawn in something dull and white that glowed faintly when I shone my flashlight. I stepped closer. The marks looked intentional. They looked like warnings. I had always heard the basement had been used for storage, then for a gardening club nobody remembered. The kids dared one another to go down there at midnight. No one ever stayed long. Tonight I stayed. There was a sound, like water under a sink, but not water. It was a dragging, a whisper that smelled of eraser shavings and broken teeth. I followed it past the old lockers and the furnace into the narrow corridor that led to the farthest corner of the school. The crosses multiplied. They were on the pipes, on the baseboards, even sketched on the underside of an old metal chair. Then I saw the thing. It was thin as a needle and pale as the underside of a moth's wing. It crouched in a pool of shadow, limbs folded wrong, as if the light itself hesitated to touch it. It was white, not skin, not ghost, something like old plaster shaped around a skeleton. On its chest were crosses, carved deep and dark, as if whoever had made them wanted to make sure the marks would not fade. They were not drawn with a child's hand. They were carved with purpose. My throat closed. I should have run. I did not. It raised its head. There were no eyes, only hollows, and whatever looked like a mouth was a ragged seam that made no sound. The whisper rose, and the room remembered a dozen wrong names. It whispered Marcus. It said Evelyn. It said my name too. Not the polite way a teacher calls a roll, but the way something counts bones. I dropped the broom. It laughed. No, that is the wrong word. It echoed, a wet sound that filled the cement. The crosses on its chest seemed to pulse. I backed into a stack of crates. My flashlight swung and caught the white skin, catching on carved lines that had been drawn again and again until the flesh looked mapped with prayer. I understood then that the crosses were not there to ward it off. They were there to keep something in. "Who are you?" I breathed. It cocked its head. The air went cold enough to burn the inside of my mouth. It lifted one long hand and pointed to the wall. On the wall were photographs from decades ago, teams and prom nights, faces frozen in smiles. Someone had scratched out the eyes on a few of them. Someone had drawn tiny crosses over their chests. When I looked closer, I saw the pattern. The crosses matched the ones on the thing's ribs. It was collecting them, names, faces, like a gardener pinning vows to a trellis, then wearing the trellis as skin. I tried to move. My feet were bricks. It stepped toward me, each movement bending wrong and making high, brittle noises like dry bread. Closer, closer, until I could feel its breath, a cool residue, like the smell of vinyl and erased chalkboards. I remembered Marcus in art class making little white sculptures from modeling clay. I remembered Evelyn staying late to practice lines for the school play. I remembered their laughter in the hall, the way it used to sting my ears like two bright bells. "Why?" I asked. The word came out thinner than I wanted. It touched the cross carved into its chest, and then traced the nearest photograph with a finger that left a smear of white where it passed. Its whisper changed into a chant that pressed against my skull. It did not need sound to speak. It spoke by remembering. When it remembered Marcus, I saw Marcus's last steps, a stair that seemed endless, a door that closed, a hand on the metal locker handle that never opened. When it remembered Evelyn, I saw her turn, pale, ball into a crawl space beneath the stage. The thing was a tank of memories, full of the last minutes before each person vanished. Kept, cataloged, worn. "I won't let you take me," I said, because saying anything felt necessary. I don't know whom I thought I was bargaining with. The creature tilted its head again and pressed its forehead to mine. For a second, the world folded into a single image, the basement as a throat, my life as a sound swallowed. I tasted cold metal and old glue. I saw my mother's face when she dropped me off at my first day of school. I saw the letter I never sent her. I saw all the small, ordinary entries that made a life. When the thing exhaled, it took a fragment with it. My vision laced with white. I staggered back. I made it upstairs. I stumbled into the main hall and found the nurse's office. I banged on the window. Mrs. Simmons opened the door, rubbing sleep from her eyes. I tried to explain. I could not. The words were trapped like moths. When she saw the state of my hands, small white scars like tiny crosses, her mouth went thin. "It marks you," she whispered. "They said it marks the ones it keeps." The town called it legend. The internet called it creepypasta. The police called it unsolved cases. I called it the thing that had put my name on its list. I tried to forget, to put away the images. For days I worked, cleaned, and pretended the basement was just cement and mice. But each night, small things happened. The lights in the gym would flicker. An abandoned locker would be slightly ajar. The scent of erased chalk would curl under my door. I grew afraid to be alone. On the 7th night after I saw it, Principal Carter called me to the office. He had an envelope in his hand. Inside were photos, recent ones of the choir room, the library. Someone had scratched crosses on the pictures. At the bottom, a Polaroid I did not recognize. It was my back, taken from the doorway of the supply closet. In the photograph, someone had already drawn a circle of tiny crosses on the small of my back. I burned the photo. I told myself that would end it, but it did not. The marks it left on me began to itch under my skin. At night, when the house was a black thing and the radiator hissed, I would wake with lines of cold where I did not remember being touched. My fingers trembled. I counted days in my head. 1, 2, 3. And on the 4th night, I woke to a whisper at the edge of my memory. It was not outside. It was inside my skull. A thin voice reciting names. It said Marcus. It said Evelyn. It said me. I drove to the school in a white drizzle. The parking lot was empty. The front door stood unlocked, as it always was at night, as if waiting for someone. I went down the corridor with my flashlight and felt my steps measured, as if the building itself had learned my weight. When I reached the basement door, there were fresh crosses around the knob, drawn with something I could not name. The thing had been patient. It had been patient enough to learn how to wait. I opened the door. The basement was colder than the outside air. The white thing sat on the stairs, hunched like a sorrowful child, the crosses on its chest bright as new coin. It looked at me, and for the first time, I understood. It was not only keeping them, it was becoming them. Each cross was a claim. Each name was a layer. It wanted a place as much as I wanted to leave. It wanted a voice. As I stepped forward, it reached out and touched my forehead with a finger like a twig. It did not hurt. It was only a pressure, a promise. My life streamed backward in a single, sharp vision, the way my laughter had sounded when I was 10, the sharp blue of my father's truck, the quiet night my sister packed her things and left. It took those small things and folded them into itself like a seam. It swallowed a scrap of me and left a cross where it had been. I did not struggle. Later, when the police came to the school and the cameras showed a blur on the stairwell, they said I had walked into an empty room and never come back. They showed my truck in the lot, my keys on the dash. They called me missing. They put flyers on telephone poles. The basement remained, cold and patient. New crosses appeared on its walls, like a catalog growing by a single page each week. Sometimes at night, when the wind presses its face to the windows, someone in Holloway claims they hear the janitor whistle as he sweeps. They say his tune is soft and slow, full of names. When you walk past the boiler room, check the photographs on the wall. You might see a fresh face with the eyes carefully crossed out. You might see a tiny white circle on a chest, 3 neat marks drawn with a hand that never trembles. If the thing chooses you, it will be quiet. It will not take you with a scream. It will take you with a memory and with a cross and with the gentle, irreversible turning of a page. I hope you do not hear my name. But if you do, if, in the dark, A whisper slides across your spine and calls you by a sound you cannot place. Remember the crosses. Remember the basement. Remember that some things do not want to be chased away. Some things are hungry for being kept. Second story, the Chalked Hollow of Willow Creek. I remember the first night like it happened yesterday, though my hands still tremble when I say it aloud. My name is Evan, and I worked late shifts sweeping the halls of Willow Creek High after practice so I could afford gas and ramen. The town was the kind of place where everybody pretended nothing bad ever happened, but secrets lived in the brick. Quiet, patient, hungry. The school smelled like floor polish and old trophies. I was alone except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the echo of my own broom. I heard the locker room clock strike the hour. I had no watch, only the echo, and decided to finish the south wing before going home. That was when I found the first chalk mark, a tiny cross, white and precise, on the tile at the base of classroom 15. It looked childish, but it made my throat close. I knelt, traced it with my fingertip, and my skin crawled as if the chalk were colder than the tile. I told myself it was a prank. Kids loved pranks here. But then I found another cross in the stairwell, and another in the janitor closet, and the crosses led down into the basement no one used anymore. The door to the boiler room was rusted. The padlock had been cut cleanly. The darkness that opened beneath felt like a mouth. Someone had drawn full rows of crosses on the concrete walls, each line measured and neat, as if someone was counting or sealing something. The more crosses I saw, the louder my heart drummed. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. I wanted to push the fear down like every other time life pushed me down. But curiosity is a greedy animal. The basement smelled wrong. Old milk, dust, and the metallic tang of something behind the pipes. I followed the crosses to a smaller room, the kind of space that had once held old science displays and boxes of prom decorations. In the center of the floor, there was a shape on the concrete. It looked like a bundle of white cloth, stretched too thin. At first, I thought it was a mannequin someone had left. Then I saw the crosses, tiny and crude, carved across its surface with what looked like chalk, but deeper, like dried bone. It was thin. So thin its ribs showed through the fabric like the shadow of someone who had been seen too often in mirrors. Its face, if I could call it that, was nothing but a smudge of chalk and hairline cracks. Around its neck were more crosses, dozens of them, like a necklace of small pale graves. I should have run. I did not. When I stepped closer, it turned. Not like a human turns, like a page being flipped. The white stretched and folded, and the room inhaled. The creature's eyes were not eyes. They were blank ovals, and yet I felt watched in a way that pressed on my bones. It made a sound like soft scraping, like chalk on blackboard, and when it moved, it left thin, powdery footprints, crosses blooming on the concrete where its feet had been. It looked starving. My voice stuck in my throat. I tried to speak and only managed a whisper. "Who are you?" No answer. But the crosses around the room trembled as if something beneath the concrete listened. The creature tilted its head, and a thin, cracked seam opened where its mouth might be. From that seam spilled a slow, dry rasp that sounded like a teacher erasing a lesson plan from a slate no one used. People were missing in Willow Creek for weeks before anyone paid attention. Madison, from my chemistry class, did not show up for her shift at the diner. Her car was found in the church parking lot with the engine cold, but the radio still whispering static. 2 days after that, Mr. Harris, the evening math teacher, failed to return a stack of tests. The crosses on bulletin boards began to appear overnight in classrooms he had taught. Each cross was perfect, like handwriting learned over centuries. I told nobody. Who would believe me? The principal would call the police. The police would find nothing. The town would laugh and say Evan from Willow Creek had a wild imagination and needed a counselor. I saved myself with silence. But silence is not loyalty. The crosses kept coming. They crawled like mold, on bathroom tiles, under cafeteria trays, inside the margins of returned essays. Every time someone vanished, a fresh cross appeared on their locker or on the back of a seat. I started seeing them in places they could not be. The fog over the river shaped into a pale cross at dawn. The wilted oak by the football field casting a shadow like a tiny cruciform. My reflection in the convenience store window had a faint chalk mark on its temple. I refused to tell anyone because naming the thing felt like handing it an invitation. I went back once to get proof. I brought my phone, a flashlight, and all the courage I could borrow. The hollow under the bleachers smelled of dust and old glue. The creature waited there, and when it saw me, it folded like paper. Its skin was covered in small crosses, and they pointed to the west wall, to the floor, to me, tiny compasses of white. I tried to step back. My feet would not obey. "You belong to us," the chalk whispered, though no mouth moved. My phone slipped and broke on the concrete, scattering light like a failed star. The creature moved closer. It pressed across to my forehead, and I felt a cold filing, as if someone were scraping out the part of me that remembered sunlight. Pain flared sharp and then dull, replaced by the odd sensation of settling, as if I were being stored, cataloged. I woke up on the school lawn at dawn, with my breath clouding the air, though it was a warm morning. My hair was laced with chalk dust. The padlock in my pocket had been bent and polished smooth. I had no memory of the walk home, only a smear of white across my hand that would not wash away. In the bathroom mirror that night, there was a small pale cross at the base of my skull, faint as a scar but deep as bone. I told myself it was a dream. Madison was never found. Mr. Harris's tests were returned to the faculty mail with every grade circled in chalky white. The town talked about runaways and bad decisions, and the crosses proliferated like a language. They began to appear on me, on my shirt, on my skin, on the inside of my palm, as if someone had written my name in tiny script and then replaced the letters with crosses. One evening, the lights in the gym went out while a pep rally rehearsal was still in motion. Voices stammered, shoes squeaked, and then there were no voices at all. Only the rustle of fabric and the soft scraping of something moving across the floor. When the lights snapped back, a new line of crosses ran along the underside of the bleachers where I had been standing. They were wet-looking and perfect, pointing inward. I understood then. The crosses were not marks of death. They were maps. They mapped what belonged in the hollow places, what the thing considered its ledger. I tried to leave town. I packed a duffel, put my keys in my pocket, and drove until the welcome sign blurred into the dark. But every time I stopped at a motel, a fresh chalk line appeared on the bedside lamp or along the mirror. I could not shake it. The crosses followed like a disease. My arms began to itch at night, and when I scratched, I found powder under my nails. The last night I remember clearly, I went back to the basement with the intention to burn it, everything. I wanted to close the ledger. I held a match to the bundle in the center room, and the flame went thin and choked like it had swallowed ash. The creature uncoiled and watched me with empty eyes. It smiled then, slow and patient. The fire did not take. Instead, the room exhaled a dust that tasted like eraser crumbs, and the crosses crawled up my legs like ants. I felt light, lighter than I had ever felt, and a terrifying clarity settled over me. The chalk loosened the part of me that said no. It filed away my edges. If you find a tiny cross on the floor of Willow Creek High, on the last stair on the back of a locker inside an old textbook, know this, it is counting. It counts until its ledger is full. Now when I look in the mirror, there is more white than flesh at the corners of my eyes. Sometimes I forget my own name for a second and have to test it on my tongue. Sometimes at night, I hear the soft scrape of chalk on concrete, and I stand very still because I do not want to answer. I am writing this because habit is heavy and because I think the thing likes words. If you read my name in the margins of an old notebook, if you find me in the hollow under the bleachers, do not look it in the face. I didn't look away. Third story, the Chalked Hollow of Millfield. I remember the first time I heard the scraping under Rowan High. Not because anyone told me, but because the lights in the science wing went out, and something like breathing threaded itself through the vents. My name is Ethan Harper, and I grew up 3 blocks from the old brick building in Millfield, where the gym smelled of sweat, and the lockers kept secrets. We were the kind of kids who dared each other on late afternoons, who left snack wrappers in the stairwells and pretended the basement was just a story adults told to keep us from sneaking out. I believed that, until the night I found the crosses. It started with Anna missing. She was 16, with a laugh that stuck in the back of your throat like a song you could not place. She was last seen after choir practice, leaning her head against the custodian's closet door and sending me a thumbs up. The next morning, her locker was open and the chalkboard in room 2 was erased in haste, except for one thing: a small, trembling cross drawn in white chalk where the teacher's name usually sat. People said she ran away. People said she would show up at lunch, smiling, embarrassed. People stopped saying much when the janitor found the smear of chalk on the basement stair handrail, like a fingertip dragged through powdered moonlight. I started staying late, because that was what you do when a small town wraps itself in silence and expects someone else to knock the lid off. I told myself I was looking for answers. I told myself I was looking for Anna. The truth is, I wanted to prove there was nothing there, because when you are 17, you believe being brave is the same as being right. The basement stank of old paint and damp cardboard. The fluorescent bulbs flickered in the long hallway where the lockers thinned into storage. I kept my phone flashlight steady, listening to every small thing until I could name it. A rat, a loose pipe, my own heartbeat. Then I saw them. Not a dozen, but many dozens of tiny crosses scrawled along the cinder block in hurried, childish lines, some half erased, some bearing the dark smudges of being wiped with gloved hands. They ran like a map down to a door that had always been locked. The maintenance room we joked held the furnace and our worst nightmares. My hand was cold on the handle. The lock gave with an easy sigh, like a throat clearing. Inside the room, the light above the sink was out. A single coil of chalk lay on the workbench, white against the oil stains. And there, curled on the concrete like a discarded coat, was something that looked wrong, in a way words almost failed to hold. It was thin in a way that made you think of hunger. It was pale, the kind of white that eats color, the pupilless kind of white that lives in empty jars. Across its chest, someone had drawn crosses, perhaps to bind it, perhaps to mark it, perhaps as a map back home. The crosses were messy, hurried, like fingerprints pressed into chalk. It had no face the way a shadow has no face. Instead, there was a suggestion of hollows and the slow suggestion of a mouth opening for air that belonged to the school. When it moved, the dust around its wrists caught light like breath. I should have run then. I should have screamed until the roof came down. Instead, I found my voice small and curious. "Anna?" I said, and the word was a stone dropped into a black pond. The thing tilted its head, and the chalk across its chest twitched as if the crosses were reading my name back to me. It spoke without sound. I felt the sentence in my teeth, a scraping like chalk on stone. Images threaded through me, lockers, a note folded into a hymn book, a girl's eyes widening and then folding inward, the smell of chalk and the hollow of an old heating vent. I smelled Anna like wet paper. A cold, bright anger lit me. I reached for it. I thought, impossibly bravely, that I could pull her out. I wrapped my hands around the thin wrist, and the chalk rasped like a laugh. The crosses burned under my palms. For a wild second, light scalded behind my eyes, and I saw 100 small hands drawing crosses across their own chests, sealing themselves into a game that had become a prison. Then the thing folded, not like flesh, but like a map being closed, and the room filled with that sound you hear when something remembers an old name. Teat took. I felt it take. It pressed into my skin, not pain but memory, and when it drew back, Anna's voice was folded into my throat like a borrowed coin. I ran. The basement door slammed behind me, not with force but with satisfaction. Upstairs, the school hummed oblivious, the gym crowd laughing, a teacher calling a student's name, and my hands stung where the chalk had bitten. Anna was not with me. Something of her flickered beneath my ribs when I breathed, and at night I woke to the smell of chalk on my pillow. They called the police. They questioned. They looked at the maintenance log and at security footage that showed me descending alone and no one leaving. They said I was overworked, that teenagers do strange things, that grief invents monsters when it cannot find people. They took statements and said they would keep watch. They painted the basement wall where the crosses were, as if color would hide the fact that someone had been marked there. But the crosses come back. At first, in small ways, a white streak on a classroom window, a thumbprint on a locker hinge. Then, at a distance, the sound under the vents resumes, patient as the turning of a page. At night, when the house is quiet and the streetlights throw the windows into long knives, I can hear a chalk line rasping inside my bones. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, there is a pale smear along my collarbone in the exact shape of a cross drawn by an unsteady hand. I went back once, months later, when the town's patience had thinned and neighbors had begun to whisper that maybe Anna had left town. I descended with a flashlight and a pocket full of stubbornness and found the maintenance room empty, the chalk gone, the air thin. I traced the cinder block where the crosses had been, half expecting dust to bloom under my fingertips. Nothing. Then a voice, Anna's, or a patch of her stitched into the dark, said my name in a place that was not my ear, and I understood with a clarity that made my teeth ache. They collect what listens. I understood what they had been doing to each other before the crosses held them, drawing marks to make something stop wanting, to make absence into shape. And I understood that I had not rescued Anna. I had invited the mark into myself, and it was patient. It keeps the shapes it likes. It collects names. Now when students leave late, they glance toward the maintenance room and hurry. Teachers swap notes with quiet eyes. The town nods like a body that has learned to move around a sore tooth. I keep my collar high. I sleep with the light on. And sometimes, when the hallway is empty and the night bell tolls like a distant heart, I take chalk from the drawer and with hands I cannot look away from, draw a single tiny cross on my inner wrist. I do it because I remember Anna's laugh and because the thing in the basement learned to speak by listening. I do it because the crosses are not only on walls, they are names and they are promises. I do it because I learned that once you make a bargain in the dark of a schoolroom, the school remembers you, and the price is not paid so much as carried. Someday, they will come for someone else. I know this in the way a bell knocks its last note and the room holds its breath. And when they do, the crosses will be waiting, patient and white as bone. Fourth story. The Chalked Silence of Willowbrook. I remember the first time I saw it, because the chalk dust on the floor still clung to my shoes like a promise. My name is Ethan Carter, and I worked the night shift at Willowbrook High, sweeping classrooms until the lights blinked dead and the town slept. The principal always said the school had character, old brick, long hallways, a basement that smelled like old paint and bad decisions. I believed him until the night the lights refused to stay off. It started with disappearances. Kids stopped coming home, but the police shrugged and handed out flyers that dissolved in the rain. Parents whispered about bad choices and runaway kids. I told myself not to pry. I told myself that a janitor minding late hours had no business in other people's tragedies. But curiosity is a small, relentless animal, and it gnawed at me until one night I found the basement door ajar. There were crosses on the walls, drawn in a hurry and then retraced a dozen times, smeared with something that dried like ash. I thought at first someone had made them for a dare, but the crosses were different. Small, careful, pressed into the plaster with fingernails, and each one pointed at the floor as if accusing the ground. The air felt wrong, as if someone had opened a window on a winter I had not yet lived through. I turned on the flashlight, and the beam trembled. And there it was, thin and white and still. It did not stand. It leaned like a reed in a slow current, and where its skin should have been, there was a texture like paper left too long in the rain. Crosses had been chalked on it, little chalk crosses all over its chest and throat, drawn with a hand that shook and then grew steady, as if the person who drew them had learned to breathe through the trembling. It had no face in any way we would call a face, only hollows that hummed when I walked by. I should have run. I should have called someone. But my feet only moved closer. Up close, I could see faint letters etched beneath the chalk, names maybe, words I could not read without tilting my head. It looked at me, not with eyes, but with a focus, as if it were listening for a particular sound. I laughed out loud to cover the cold that braided through my ribs. The laugh sounded small. The next morning, there was another missing student. Maria Alvarez. She was the kind of girl who left notes in the art room and played the piano badly, but with terrible heart. I had seen her the week before, complaining about the smell in the auditorium. Her mother left the door unlocked for the police, because in Willowbrook, the only people who locked their doors were those who wanted something kept in. I started to find chalk on places it should not be, on the underside of desks, inside lockers that no one had used since graduation, in the margin of textbooks whose owners were gone. Once, I opened the choir room, and the piano keys had been ticked through as if someone had tried to play the scale with nails. The chalk crosses multiplied like seeds in the gutters. I asked Coach Reynolds if he had seen anything. He clapped my shoulder and blamed the teenagers. I asked the librarian, Miss Holt, and she said she had heard whispers between the stacks, but dismissed it as wind. No one wanted to look at the basement. It was where the boiler hissed and where mice had the kind of meetings we were not invited to. One night, I stayed later than usual. The walkie I carried crackled with static, and the halls were a throat of echo. I heard footsteps below, not mine, and the sound of chalk scraping wood. I followed as if led. The basement door closed behind me with the sound of a book dropping from a high shelf, and my flashlight trembled like a scared child's hand. It was waiting in the doorway, taller than the ceiling should allow, thin as the space between two breaths. The crosses covered it, each one a little map. When it moved, it made no sound of limbs, only a soft shush like pages turning. I thought of Maria's piano and the way her fingers hesitated on a wrong note, and then I understood. It learned rhythm from the things it swallowed. I tried to speak, but my voice was a match struck and gone. It raised a hand that was too long and too narrow, and where its palm should have been there were more crosses, tiny and precise. I could not tell if the marks were protective or hungry. Then, in a voice like chalk on glass, it said my name. I had never told anyone the name I used for nights. It knew the nicknames I hid from daylight. I ran. I ran without measuring the strength in my legs, and behind me the chalked thing uncoiled like a shadow stretching after sunset. I slammed doors and cursed the old hinges, but the school had other ideas. Hallways became loops, stairwells folded back on themselves. Every exit I found led me to the auditorium, where the stage curtains hung like damp throats. On the stage, the chairs were arranged in a neat, impossible circle, and inside each chair there was a coat, and inside each coat there was chalk dust. I reached the door to the parking lot, and the handle was cold like metal in a coffin. I turned, and there it was, as if the school had exhaled, and what came out was not air. It moved toward me with the patience of tide water. I screamed. I screamed until the sound broke me, and for an instant we both held the same sound in our mouths. It touched me where the ribs flare and the skin is thin, and the touch felt like erasing. Memories slipped like brittle paper from my chest. My father at the fair, the smell of gasoline, the way Maria laughed at her own offbeat songs. I felt my voice thin and pale, the edges rubbed away. Then something warm pricked at the back of my neck, chalk, soft as ash, drawing itself into my skin. The crosses were being traced, not by it, but through me. I thought I would fight. I thought of names and of small, stubborn things, my mother's coffee mug, my scholarship, the dog I had promised to rescue. But the thing steadied me with a gentleness that was nearly kind. It pressed its forehead, if that is the word, against mine, and where its head touched there was a cold like the inside of a freezer. I lost the world by degrees. The lights blurred into a single white smear, like someone had taken a photograph and left it too long in the sun. My hands left the railing. I could feel something writing on my chest in small, precise movements. Each cross was a syllable, each syllable a ledger. I tried to say help, but the vowels fell out. When I woke, I was in the art room, under a table that smelled of turpentine and old glue. The dust on my palms was white and familiar. My reflection in the safety glass was wrong. My face echoed like a photograph left near a light. I held up my shirt, and there, traced into my skin in a chalky frost, was a cross. I put my palm over it, and my fingers trembled. They asked where I had been. I said I had fallen asleep sweeping. They believed me because people want explanations that fit the world. Maria's mother did not believe anything anymore. Her eyes had been emptied by missing pieces. The missing students were still missing. The crosses on the walls were more numerous. I saw Miss Holt in the library late one afternoon, and she smiled like someone remembering a song, her hands white at the edges where chalk had baked into her skin. At night, the whispers taste like paper in my mouth. Sometimes when I pass the stairwell, I hear the piano, a single wrong note played over and over, and I think of how Maria's fingers might be moving now, and I cannot tell if she is playing or being played. My dreams are filled with tight, small rooms where the walls press in with the neatness of handwriting. I try to scratch the marks from my chest, but the crosses only go deeper, as if the chalk is learning the lines of me. People still come to Willowbrook High, and I still clean. I set out mops and sweep confessionals into neat piles. I smile with the margin of my mouth and say, "Good morning," like a bell. At night, I go down where the paint peels and the pipes sing. The basement door is never quite shut. The thing, whatever it is, waits in a place between a room and an absence, and sometimes it speaks my name the way one might call a lost coat. I know what happens to those who stay too long. I have watched the contours of myself soften and the chalk map itself across my ribs. I am writing this because the sound of the chalk is the last honest thing I own. If anyone reads this, understand that some doors are not doors. Some marks are not warnings, but invitations. Tonight, as always, I went to the basement. The crosses traced themselves across the plaster like a tide. It reached for me, and I did not run. I wanted to see if I could take the chalk in both hands and throw it back. I wanted to be human and messy and noisy and wrong. But when it touched my face, the world folded into the white paper of its skin, and I understood in a terrible, slow way that to resist was to become the very thing it needed. I felt the first cross carve me open like a word. I thought of Maria and of the piano and of 1,000 small, unremarkable things that make up a life. Then I knew. I knew the sound of each name it had eaten, and they were not gone but arranged like notes on a staff. I could hear them singing through the chalk. If you come to Willowbrook, do not go down into the basement. If you hear the piano, turn it off. If a stairway loops, do not follow the loop until it makes a circle around your chest. And above all, do not let whatever draws crosses on its skin teach you its alphabet. I am writing this with the last of my clear letters because the chalk already knows how to finish what I begin. When the crosses multiply on your walls, remember how soft the thing was when it first touched me. Remember the way it learned to be patient. I am no longer sure where Ethan Carter ends and the chalk begins. The last thing I remember before the basement ate my name was a single word, faint as ash, stay. Fifth story, Chalked Hallways of Ashford. I remember the first time I stayed late at Ashford High. Not because I had homework, but because I liked the hush that settled over the building like a held breath. I was Evelyn Harper then, a night shift library assistant with a crooked grin and a habit of reading aloud to empty chairs. The janitor, old Jake, would always wave me off with a paper cup of bad coffee. He said the school had its own rhythm after dark. I liked that rhythm. I liked how the fluorescent lights hummed like a tired insect, how the lockers echoed footsteps that sounded far away. I liked the silence, until the night the chalk began to speak. It started with a smear on the third-floor landing, a line of white that did not belong. I thought it was a kid's prank at first, a board signature traced by bored fingers. But then I found the crosses, the same small cross, drawn again and again, pressed into the corner of every classroom doorframe. They were too precise for a joke. They felt intentional. I felt watched. I told Jake, who shrugged and said some students were strange, and left it at that. But I couldn't forget the way the air grew denser near the crosses, like something had been held there and then released. I started staying later, pretending to reorganize shelves while I watched the halls. The chalk smelled like cold rain, and when I ran my fingertip over one mark, my finger came away powdery, as if I had touched a memory. One night, around the time the clock settled into that middle hour between 10 and midnight, I heard a whisper from the locker row. It was not a human voice. It was the rustle of chalk on brick, a soft scratch like someone rubbing their thumb over a map. The whisper said my name. Not loudly, not in words I could always understand, but in that little noise, the way a page turns when it wants to tell you something. I answered. Because who else was there? No one. The whisper laughed. After that, things escalated. Classrooms were neater in the way that empty places can be neater, as if someone had carefully removed every trace of us. Photographs of graduating classes had faces scraped out with chalk, leaving pale ovals like holes. The intercom would crackle with static, and if I pressed my ear close, I could make out hums. Children singing, off-key, a song I had never heard but that clung to my bones. I began to dream in chalk, pale hands tracing patterns on my skin while I slept, and woke with the taste of dust in my mouth. I tried to leave. I really did. But the night would fold around me like paper, and the roads out of Ashford would seem longer, the streetlights slanting wrong. Once, I drove toward the highway and found myself at the school gate again. Tires grinding on gravel I had not meant to drive over. The doors opened for me as if they had been waiting. I understood then that something was tired of being ignored. I began to follow the marks. They led me to the basement, the old wing where the boiler gurgled and the smell of old science experiments hung like a curtain. Down there, in a room that had once been a supply closet, the chalk was thickest. It covered the walls in a maze of crosses, and in the center was a thing. Not quite a shape, not quite a shadow. It was white and thin, like a rag pulled too tight over a frame. It had lines where eyes might be, but they were nothing more than chalk hollows. I felt the urge to draw those lines myself. I felt the urge to finish what had been begun. When I stepped closer, the thing moved, not with limbs, but as if the air around it had decided to fold. It whispered my name, and when I answered, it spoke back with my voice, only slower, as if from the bottom of a pipe. I remember the panic then, my heart pounding like feet on stairs, and how I thought I could run, but my shoes were stuck to the concrete like old gum. The thing reached out, or the room reached in, and I felt chalk under my nails, felt the dry shift under my skin as if my hands were becoming paper. Leave, I said. My voice was a stranger's, high and thin. The thing smiled, or the wall did. It began to trace the crosses on my forearm with its fingertip, a cold that wasn't cold. I tried to pull away, but every time I moved, the crosses appeared on my skin where there had been none. They burned a little while they appeared, like a paper cut etching the name of a town I had been trying to forget. I realized then what the chalk wanted. It wanted names. It wanted people to remember the shape of the building in their flesh. It wanted witnesses who would write their own names in dust. It wanted to stay. I could feel its loneliness like a weight. I wanted to be free, but the thing was not cruel without reason. It was hungry in the way old houses are hungry when new paint covers the cracks. It wanted a place to sit and be listened to. I was foolish enough to think I could offer that place and walk away. The first time it ate a memory, I forgot a birthday. Not the date, but the warmth of the breakfast table, the sound of the coffee pot clicking. I found gaps in my life like torn paper. After each gap, the chalk smiled a little wider on the wall. I tried to read the crosses as if they were a language, but the letters were not for me. They were for the building. They spelled a silence that kept growing. On the final night, the night I knew I would not be leaving, the principal's office was open. Mr. Whitman sat at his desk, eyes hollow even though he was alive, pencil dropped from a hand that shook. He looked at me with a kindness that was more terrifying than anything else, and he said quietly, "We all owe it something." I did not understand then. I understood later. The chalk had a contract. It took from those who stayed to keep the school from being forgotten by the world outside. I tried to fight. I scribbled my name on the wall in big letters, smearing it with both hands, trying to prove I was not a shadow. The chalk erased half of it with a single sweep. It spoke in the empty space where my words had been. "You will do better." I felt the letters slide under my skin like worms of powder. My fingers turned white, then cracked, and when I looked down, I saw crosses where my scribble had been. Neater, more deliberate. I was learning the language. As the last light died outside, I felt something seal across my throat. Not an actual seal, but a quieting. I could still think, but my words were slow to find the air. I reached for the door, and it was there, but so was the chalk spreading up my arms, up my neck, painting me in a shade paler than I had ever been. I could see the shape of me on the wall beside the thing, an outline done in the same hand that had been drawing the crosses all this time. I will not pretend there was a battle. There was only a small human struggle against a vast, patient thing. It did not want my pain. It wanted my name to stay. It traced those crosses over and over until my memory of ever wanting anything else was faint as chalk dust. The last thing I remember hearing was my own name echoing off the ceiling, not spoken by me, but by the wall that had learned to speak like me. It said softly, "Stay." Now, when the night comes, students walk past my outline on the basement wall. They see the crosses and feel a chill, but they do not stay to listen. They put it on their phones, laugh a little, and move on. The building feels full, though it is empty of what you might call life. Sometimes the intercom crackles with a reading from a book I loved. Sometimes the chalk sings. And if you ever walk the halls late, if you ever feel the urge to stay, know this: the school collects what it needs to be remembered. It will ask nicely. It will ask with your voice. And if you answer, if you step close enough to hear it say your name, it will teach you to remember too well.